Hello, my name is Benjamin Clark, and I'm a student at Pacifica. I'm a junior, and I am involved in the digital arts program and am enjoying my experience at Pacifica. So far at my time there, I have learned to think about and approach complex issues such as morality and American foreign policy with caution and awareness, to sort through these ideas and think about them with all sides of the argument considered. I have learned this largely from the Socratic-style discussion where the class sits in a circle and we talk with each other and share ideas about the topic. This type of discussion, I noticed, really allows you to hear other people's ideas. On the first day of school this year, I walked into class and we sat down and had a discussion on what we thought morality was. It was interesting to see how others thought about morality and how their ideas differed from my own. There it was. We got right into it on the first day, and we had a serious discussion. That is how the environment, I think, at Pacifica is unique and has so far taught me to approach serious issues like the ones being talked about today. Brian T. Kennedy is president of the American Strategy Group, a think tank dedicated to understanding the strategic threats to the United States. Mr. Kennedy is also a board member and senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, where he served as president from 2002 to 2015. During his 25-year tenure at the Claremont Institute, he directed their national security project and served as publisher of the Claremont Review of Books. Mr. Kennedy is a member of the Independent Working Group on Missile Defense and is a co-author of Sharia, The Threat to America. His articles on national security affairs and public policy issues have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Investors Business Daily, and Hillsdale College's Imprimis. Mr. Kennedy is a native Californian and a graduate of Claremont McKenna College. Please assist me in welcoming Mr. Kennedy to the stage.
Thank you, Benjamin. Good morning, everyone. So good to be here. Thank you, Benjamin, for that kind introduction. Great to be part of this great conversation series. Thank you as well to Keith Carlson and David O'Neill for all you've done, not inviting me. That was a form of bad judgment on your part, but so proud of everything the Pacifica Christian community has done to build this school. And that's really important, I think, here in Orange County. My project at the American Strategy Group is to craft a new national security policy informed by the principles of the American founding. We engage in the long-term education of American elites so that we can refound our regime based on the principles of human freedom, not because they are some academic niceties, but because we think they are critical to our survival as a free people. Our subject this morning is morality and foreign policy, and I expect I'll be slightly more controversial than my good friend Will Inboden. I would offer to you that it was not so long ago that we Americans thought every political decision was a moral decision. When it comes to American foreign policy and national security, even more so. The purpose of our politics, after all, is to ensure our safety and our happiness. In Federalist 43, Madison speaks of the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of society are the objects at which all political institutions aim, and to which all such institutions must be sacrificed. Pretty clear, I think. In a dangerous world, what could be more important? Also, as a practical matter, every political decision has a moral component. My good friend Tom McClintock, a congressman from Northern California, was in the California Assembly and then was a state senator, but worked with me at the Claremont Institute for a few years up in Sacramento. Tom would always say when he walked into the Capitol and voted that he always thought when he pressed the button, yes or no, on an Assembly or Senate bill, he said, on the other end of that button is a man with a gun who is willing to enforce the law should the governor sign it into law, even if it were to build the most insignificant thing. In the city council, If you build a stop sign, someone has to stop. And if they don't stop, the police will arrest them. And if there's a controversy, as we know, bad things can happen. So every political decision, in so many ways, is a moral decision. When it comes to American foreign policy, this is magnified many times over. For every decision the president or the Congress makes, there may be tens of thousands of men with guns, or men and women whose fingers are on the controls of a drone, or in a fighter plane, or a bomber. And when it comes to foreign policy, if the president asks to send our young men to war to give their lives for their country, it better be for a just and moral cause. It's one thing, after all, to spend the lives of our children, if one could be so crass, perhaps even the graduates of Pacifica Christian High School someday. It's one thing to ask that we send them, those young people, to fight and die for the United States and our freedom. It's quite another to ask them to give their lives for some other people in a faraway land, no matter how dire the situation may be. And so each and every decision we make politically demands a moral understanding of the world and of human freedom and of our social compact as Americans. The great challenge of our day involves Islamic terrorism. Dr. Inboden referred to some of these problems. It is the project of Islamic terrorism not merely to kill us, but to demoralize us. Demoralize. To make us believe our civilization is not worth defending, that the West is not worth defending. In my time with you this morning, I would like to make 3 points which I think have shaped American foreign policy and American strategy in profound ways, and I would submit to you have altered fundamentally our politics, including, I think, this presidential campaign. And I'll present these in the form of a question, really. First, what is the morality of telling the American people, as we did after September 11th, that Islam is a religion of peace, when you know that not to be true? That way of thinking has shaped now over a decade of American foreign policy and American politics. How should we think about that? Second, I would like to address the morality of importing into the country many million Muslims, knowing that we cannot adequately screen their backgrounds and knowing they have a religious and ideological view that is antithetical to America and Western civilization. And we do so while allowing Islamic groups to operate in the United States, knowing they are terrorist organizations that raise money for the Muslim Brotherhood at home and abroad, give comfort to domestic terrorist cells, and aid in the undermining of regimes allied with the United States abroad. And my third and final point this morning will be, what is the morality of leaving the United States vulnerable to nuclear attack from nations that are building and have built nuclear ballistic missiles that are capable of destroying not merely the great cities of the United States, but the infrastructure of the whole country, effectively ending American and Western civilization? In the Q&A, I hope we can discuss all these things. So first, Islam is a religion of peace. You've all heard that been said. Let me say I think it was a grave error, while bodies of American citizens were still burning in the rubble of the World Trade Center, to have President Bush declare that Islam was a religion of peace when he knew it was not, or should have known it was not. The United States was, of course, attacked on September 11th by members of Al-Qaeda who believed they were carrying out a fatwa by Osama bin Laden against the United States and the West. And although President Bush said that Islam was a religion of peace, a meme that continues to this day by President Obama and even by some conservative leaders, it is important to realize that it is not a religion of peace, and indeed sees itself as an enemy of the West. President Bush believed or was otherwise persuaded that Islam was a different strain somehow of the Judeo-Christian heritage, or at least thought differences so insignificant that it didn't matter that it wasn't quite the truth. He would say to Congress on September 21st, 2001, quote, "The terrorists practice a fringe form of Islamic extremism that has been rejected by Muslim scholars and the vast majority of Muslim clerics, a fringe movement that perverts the peaceful teachings of Islam." President Bush said the peaceful teachings of Islam. The terrorist directive commands them to kill Christians and Jews, to kill all Americans and make no distinction among military and civilians, including women and children. End of quote. And he would also say, "I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. The terrorists are traitors to their own faith, trying in effect to hijack Islam itself. The enemy of America is not our many million Muslim friends, nor is it our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them," end of quote. Now, of course, everyone could understand why President Bush would not want to make enemies of 1.3 billion Muslims. But it was also the case that 1.3 billion Muslims should not have wanted to make enemies of a nuclear-armed country of 300 million angry Americans whose countrymen had just been murdered. In any case, what an amazing victory for al-Qaeda that they were able to control the message the way they did. In declaring this, Mr. Bush and his administration did the country a great disservice by trying to understand Islam as we would like it to be, rather than how they, in fact, actually see it. Although Islam is organizationally built around a belief in God, whom, as I say, they call Allah, Islam is more properly, for the purposes of our discussion, a political ideology organized around the Quran and the teachings of its founder, Muhammad. Its teachings allow for the subjugation of 1.3 billion people who, like most people, are inclined to believe there is a God and that his prophets have spoken to man. But whereas Christianity asks its adherents to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to render unto God what is God's, Islam teaches that the Quran is the absolute word of God, not subject to interpretation. That to disagree with the 6,000-odd verses of the Quran that are organized into 114 chapters or surahs, or even reinterpret them, is punishable by death. Islamic authorities of all major schools of Islam, Hanbali, Hanafi, Shiite, Maliki, they all teach that the Quran must be read so that the parts that were written last rule over the other parts. This so-called theory of abrogation requires that we look at the last chapters of the Quran, which were written after Muhammad went to Medina in 622 AD, for guidance. So, although there may be peaceful parts of the Quran, they do not guide what an adherent Muslim ought to believe. Let us look at them, and I'll only read a couple parts of them. These chapters of the Quran that were written last, Surah 9 and Surah 5. Surah 9 holds, quote, "Fight and slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war. But if they repent and establish regular prayers and practice regular charity, then open the way for them. For Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful." That's Surah 9, verse 5. Another verse, "Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and his apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the 40 people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." Let me repeat. "Fight and slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war." Surah 5, this is the last one. O ye who believe, take not the Jews and the Christians for your friends and protectors. They are but friends and protectors to each other. And he amongst you that turns to them for friendship is of them. Verily, Allah guideth not the unjust. Now, it's often said that anyone who points out these surahs is singling out the most violent parts of the Quran, and that this is somehow unfair. But I would offer that we must understand Muslims as they understand themselves. They believe that the infidel, the non-believer, is to be made into a Muslim, or to be killed, or to be made subjugated to them by conceding sovereign authority and paying a tax. To that end, they can lie to the infidel under the principle of taqiyya, that they should not be friends with him except as deception, and that they can kill the infidel. This is not, by the way, one man's interpretation. This exists in the book, the Quran, not subject to interpretation except by punishment of death. If a Muslim says otherwise, it is for all practical purposes here a lie meant to deceive us. For it is not our job to interpret Islam in ways that would make us feel better. Our job is to defend these United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Our job is to understand them as they understand themselves, and it matters not whether the number of Muslims who actually believe these things is 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 1.3 billion. We know it's believed by adherents to Islam who have taken up arms against this country, who have operated as terrorists, and who control regimes abroad who are either sponsoring terrorism against the United States, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, and Iran, or are building nuclear ballistic missiles like Iran. As for Al-Qaeda, how long have we been fighting now Al-Qaeda? It has transformed itself from a terrorist organization into a global ideological movement that inspires Muslims, young and old, by simply tapping into the fundamental tenets of Islam. The morality or immorality of having established this idea that Islam is a religion of peace hinges on its effect on both the American people and our enemies within the Islamic world. For the American people, they were told a lie knowing it was a lie. If Islam was a religion of peace, then somehow we ought not to be that worried about it. It must be somehow self-correcting. For if this were genuinely just a few bad eggs, we ought not to worry. Few bad eggs can be lent into the country in large numbers. Few bad eggs can be trusted. President Bush was a good and decent man, and I realize I'm attacking here much of his legacy. And I hope you don't think I think he's an evil man. He's not. But he didn't understand this was a moral decision he was making when he told the American people that Islam was a religion of peace. He saw it as a political narrative that served some higher political purpose. Likewise, my good friend Will Inboden is a good and decent and smart man, as you've heard this morning, and just because he worked in the Bush administration doesn't mean he subscribes to these views and he can defend himself in the Q&A, and I have nothing but respect for Will. But when you ask the American people or tell the American people a lie, knowing it was a lie for political effect, I think there has to be someday a reckoning, at least politically. And I think what we're seeing in this presidential campaign is that reckoning. The job of President Bush, was not to assert that Islam was a religion of peace, in my judgment, but to have the Islamic world demonstrate its peaceful intentions, beginning with rounding up members of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations and bringing them to justice. Instead, we emboldened by the use of that phrase, the Islamic world. They saw, the leaders of Al-Qaeda saw, that we were willing to lie to our own people about the nature of the enemy that had just attacked us. They were inspired by the creation in the United States of a political narrative that suited their purposes rather than the purposes of the American people. Today, the numbers of Al-Qaeda and ISIS are growing. The Al-Qaeda magazine, which one can find online, is literally called Inspire, for they mean to inspire a new generation of terrorists to attack the West, because they think if the great Satan is willing to lie to his own people, then victory is not merely possible, but inevitable. We have not defeated the cause of Islam. It will therefore manifest itself in 1,000 ways to do evil wherever it can. It will seek to demoralize the West and all its good-natured concern for humanity. Congressman Royce last night described conflicts all over the world, many associated with Islam. That we seek to fight these discrete battles will, I fear, distract us from defeating the cause of Islam, for we have established in the public mind that Islam is not the problem, since, after all, it's a religion of peace. But in that Islam mandates the rule of Islam over the world, its most strident adherents will do what is available to them to make this a reality. And I will not, for the sake of time, discuss the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Suffice it to say that many of the errors that were made in the execution of the wars were caused by the misunderstanding of Islam that had been shaped by this Islam as a religion of peace narrative. It is, of course, continued during the Obama administration, has been the subject of parts of this presidential campaign. Recently, Josh Ernst, the White House spokesman, you may have seen this, announced that we were in a war of narratives with ISIS. A war of narratives. A narrative, especially as used by the Obama administration, is a story that is not exactly true. It's a kind of postmodern construct that makes you feel good about what is being said. Parts are true and other parts not so true, but true enough for the purposes of what passes in this country today for political discourse. The ISIS narrative is that America is a force for evil in the modern world, that it is they who are liberating the Islamic peoples from Western corruption, and it is up to ISIS to show the, quote, cross-worshippers and democratic pagans of the West the true nature of their animosity. Now, given the recent WikiLeaks disclosures, it's entirely unclear to me anyway, where ISIS, the Obama administration, and the Clinton campaign actually disagree. The Obama narrative is that indeed the United States is the problem. Had George Bush not invaded Iraq, all would be right with the world. Had Obama and Clinton been in charge, we would never have had these problems. Even more dishonest, however, is this notion that we are fighting ISIS. Sure, we will do certain things to them now and then, but ISIS was organized, supported, and armed by the Saudi Arabians, the Qataris, and the Turks. All three are President Obama's greatest allies, much more so than Israel. We have provided ISIS, or the countries I just mentioned, with arms and foodstuffs. Whose side exactly are we on? Let me close this section by simply saying that there are very few things that cannot be explained to the American people when it comes to their safety and happiness. The question over whether or not Islam was a religion of peace was one of them. That free people ought to have the ability to decide their fate, and the American people, more than I think any other people in the world, have a sense of justice, and that when presented with the true nature of Islam, would have done the right thing, and they would have done it in a sensible way. They wouldn't have immediately thought that every single Muslim was a problem. They would have distinguished between the radicals, the terrorists, and the rest of the Islamic world. You didn't need to lie to them. They could have sorted those things out for themselves. But we needed to make incumbent upon the Islamic world that the mere idea that you could destroy the West was a bootless effort. Which leads me to my second point. What is the morality of allowing millions of Muslims into the United States? If it's true, when I was reading those parts of the Quran, if it's true that they can believe that, what would the logic be, the morality be, of inviting millions more into the country? First, we have the problem of immigration, both legal and illegal itself. Now, there are hard, practical facts that matter in this debate. There are today 30 million non-citizen foreign nationals in the United States, plus roughly 11 million who are here illegally. Most, as we know, are hardworking people who've come here because we have not done much to stop them, and we have worked for them. But we try to assimilate them at a time when our government-run education system does not adequately believe or teach the history or principles of the country, does not teach adequately math and science, such that these new immigrants will be properly trained to seek anything other than the lowest paying jobs. We try to assimilate them at a time when the regulatory state of the country pursues policies that discourage investment and economic growth. What the government does promote are welfare policies that discourage the natural energy and resourcefulness of immigrants. Needless to say, these are not ideal circumstances to assimilate any new immigrants, let alone large numbers of Muslim immigrants who have now entered the country and present to us a unique challenge. Back to the facts. During the Bush administration, when the issue of Islam became so prominent, President Bush said there were 2.3 million Muslims. The Pew Research Center said 2.35 million Muslims. This is back in 2007. The Council on American Islamic Relations today puts the number at 7 million Muslims, as did President Obama in his Cairo speech in June of 2009. Other sources today put the number at perhaps 9 million to 11 million Muslims, which would mean that there are more Muslims than there are homosexuals. I mean, you can't turn on the TV and not see, large numbers, perceptibly, of people of the LGBTQ, what does Donald Trump say? Does he throw in Q? Persuasion. So for all those people, there's more Muslims, just to put it in some broad perspective. And there's more Muslims than there are Jews in this country. And one doesn't really care, the numbers other than some of these facts. 8% of American Muslims in a Pew Center survey said that suicide bombing can sometimes be justified in defense of Islam. Now, if there were just 7 million Muslims, that means 560,000 people believe this. Among Muslims age 18 to 29, 15% believe that suicide bombing could be justified. And among this age, 60% thought of themselves first as Muslim and second as Americans. These are Muslim Americans, not just Muslim foreign nationals, but Muslim Americans. And among all age groups of Muslim Americans, 5% still had a favorable view of Al-Qaeda. Now, it might not have been crazy to ask why we should not let in more Muslims, given that they don't seem to share our view of freedom and constitutional government quite often. It turns out that Muslims have a very effective tool to assist them politically with immigration. It is specifically the Muslim Brotherhood and their organizational arm, such as the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Islamic Society of North America, and Muslim student associations around the country. Their job is to persuade American elites that Islam is a religion of peace as they grow the number of Muslims in America. Documents obtained from the Holy Land trial in Texas in 2007 that investigated terrorist funding included the following from the Muslim Brotherhood's Strategic Memorandum on North American Affairs, written in 1991. So the Muslim Brotherhood writes a memorandum and distributes it to all of its relevant leadership. And they call it the Strategic Memorandum on North American Affairs. They say the general strategic goal of the group in America, which was approved, this is from the memorandum itself, by the Shura Council and the Organizational Conference for the year 1987 is, quote, enablement of Islam in North America, meaning establishing an effective and stable Islamic movement led by the Muslim Brotherhood which adopts Muslim causes domestically and globally, and which works to expand the observant Muslim base, aims at unifying and directing Muslims' efforts, presents Islam as a civilization alternative, and supports the global Islamic State wherever it is. They're using the phrase, back in 1987, published in 1991, the global Islamic State. The memorandum goes on. Having established its leadership, the memorandum says that the Muslim Brotherhood here in North America, quote, "The process of settlement is a civilizational jihadist process with all the means. The Ikhwan," they say, the Muslim Brotherhood, "must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions." They write this in 1991. A grand jihad. That's what they talk about, a grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within. They go on to say, "Without this level of understanding, we are not up to this challenge and have not prepared ourselves for jihad yet. It is a Muslim's destiny to perform jihad and work wherever he is and wherever he lands until the final hour comes. And there is not escape from that destiny except for those who choose to slack." These are their words. This is the operational principle of the Muslim Brotherhood here in the United States. Let me just restate part of it. It's a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions. Now that's long-term strategic planning. Now, if one were to ask the average Muslim if they know any of this, the answer would be no. Indeed, very few Muslims that we meet in everyday life would understand the Quran the way I described it. They wouldn't understand the Muslim Brotherhood. But what matters is that this is what the members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Islamic world that is violent believe, who live in the United States and who operate an influence operation to have us believe that Islam is a religion of peace. We have the first bombing of the World Trade Center. We have the attacks on September 11th, the attacks around the country at Fort Hood, isolated incidents that you've all seen in the papers. You saw a few years ago the beheading of a poor woman in Oklahoma whose only sin was to not allow her Muslim coworker to convert her to Islam. That Muslim who beheaded the lady in Oklahoma, he was actually a convert who'd been trained by, he was born in the United States, but a convert who'd been trained by immigrant imams at his mosque in Moore, Oklahoma, what you might call, part of the Bible Belt of the country. Now, that we have not suffered another large-scale attack after September 11th is due in part to some success by law enforcement, certainly, but more likely the inability of the Muslim Brotherhood to capitalize on what they've built. And there is the great uncertainty as to how Americans would react to widespread terrorism within the heartland of this country. Americans may be a very genteel people, but also people whose passion for freedom could lead them to drastic measures. They might nominate someone like Donald Trump to be president. In the meantime, it presents a threat to the United States that lingers just below the surface of public debate, but one that presents unique challenges to law enforcement in the U.S. intelligence community. It's one thing to have hundreds of individuals to concern ourselves with. What if the number is in the thousands or the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of citizens whose allegiance is not to the United States, but to an operational form of Islam that seeks the destruction of the United States? We don't like to think in those terms. It will divide U.S. society, create animosity among citizens, and present a permanent threat to the peace and tranquility of the American people. In doing what they've done, terrorists mean to suggest that theirs is the winning and just cause, that the great Satan must watch as his citizens are, for instance, beheaded and feel impotence. This is a message that operates both to confuse and demoralize decent Americans who are outraged by such actions, and to energize the Muslim faithful, both here in America and abroad, that the United States can be made to lie, as I suggested earlier, to its own people about the true nature of the Islamic threat to its civilization. And again, to suggest such things is to be labeled a bigot and someone who misunderstands Islam. After all, Muslims abhor the killing of innocents, we're told. However, all observant, Quranically faithful Muslims would also believe that the infidel, the kafir, is not innocent, since they also believe, adherent Muslims, that all human beings are born Muslim, and by accepting Christianity or Judaism, have violated the most fundamental belief of any Muslim, and are therefore hardly innocent, right? So for all Muslims, born Muslims, and we've converted to Christianity or to Judaism or anything else, we can no longer be innocent, which is why they can kill with such ease women and children. Those people are not innocent. Now, it's with such twisted logic that we face this civilizational conflict. And I would add, and I say this not in a political way, that Hillary Clinton proposes bringing in possibly hundreds of thousands of refugees from Syria and other parts of the Middle East if elected. And it was Donald Trump, and again, I don't say this politically, but just as an observation of our politics, it was Trump who said that we ought to have a moratorium, not a ban, but a moratorium on Islamic immigration while we figure out how to do background checks on these people. Trump had already got to 25% in the polls by just talking tough on immigration. When he mentioned Islamic immigration, he got to 48%, and his numbers didn't move. I would offer to you that the rise of Donald Trump can be traced to the inability of America's leaders to explain in any coherent way either Islam, terrorism, or Islamic immigration, and that he tapped into the frustration of the American people to see their leaders address these questions in a sensible way, in a moral way, in anything approaching a decent way. Trump's very popular assault on political correctness was born in part from what many saw as the failure to address adequately the question of Islam and immigration. Now, to the extent we can understand morally and morality and foreign policy and the necessity to put the well-being of the American people first, I think how we talk about and think about and address this question of Islamic immigration will have profound consequences for the future of the country. We may well reach a point where Islam, to the extent that it denies the supremacy of the United States Constitution and demands that from its adherents, it becomes an ideology. It is an ideology, not a religion. As such, it will no longer be offered the protections of a religion if push really does come to shove. And we haven't thought about how to deal with that, how to talk about that. In America, we believe in freedom of religion, but only for religions that believe in freedom. We've never really had to deal with a religion that doesn't believe in human freedom. With Islam, if you are to understand it the way they understand it themselves, it would seem to me incompatible. And so over the next several years, we're going to have to get this right or suffer the consequences. And that, I think, is fundamentally a moral question. Which brings me to my final point. What is the morality of leaving the United States vulnerable to ballistic missile attack? If it's true that the Islamic world would like to kill us, or parts of it, as I say, would like to kill us, what would be the logic of leaving us vulnerable to ballistic missile attack? As was mentioned, I was part of the Independent Working Group on Missile Defense. It was started by a bunch of ex-Reagan administration officials who simply believed the Reagan formulation when it came to ballistic missiles and nuclear attack. Reagan said it would be better, and he even used the phrase, it would be the moral act to defend ourselves from a nuclear ballistic missile attack than to retaliate to one. We live today under the strategic view of mutually assured destruction. If someone launches nuclear missiles at us, then we will launch nuclear missiles at them. They kill a bunch of Americans, we'll kill a bunch of them, whoever them are. Reagan said, that doesn't make any sense. Why don't we build a system that defends us? Because that would be the moral thing to do. What a good idea. It was a common sense formulation. Today, we do not have a missile defense that will stop Russian, Chinese. We might be able to stop a few North Korean missiles, but we won't be able to stop a ship-launched Iranian ballistic missile. The Iranians wake their children up every morning still, and when they go to school, have them recite death to America and death to Israel. Every morning still. The Iranians have advanced technology. They have an agreement with the Obama administration, which looks to me and to some observers as if that will merely buy them time to develop more fully a nuclear program. But the Iranians are a very clever, skilled people. They are masters at deception. If they want to figure out how to build ballistic missiles, they will. And they don't seem to care very much about being deterred. Where did some of the final flyers, terrorists, on September 11th get their final pre-flight training? Right? They're Saudi nationals, most of them. But several of them, I think 3 of them, got their pre-flight training in Iran, in Tehran. Bin Laden's wife and family went to Iran. So the Iranians weren't that concerned about what the great Satan would do. There is a morality about building a missile defense and protecting the United States. It always struck me when I've talked about missile defense over the years that it seemed like the bleeding obvious. If we have the technology to prevent a ballistic missile attack at a time when the Iranians are testing ballistic missiles in the Caspian Sea to launch attacks against, the only logical strategy in their tests have been the United States. When you see an enemy test ballistic missiles that would like to destroy you, when he has his children recite every day, death to America and death to Israel, you might take that seriously. That seems to me like the logical, moral thing to do, that there's a certain immorality at work when we're not willing to address that threat. So let me just say in conclusion that the suicide of the West has taken many forms over the last century. There were the fields in France and Belgium in the First World War. There was the savagery of the National Socialists in Germany in World War II. There was equal savagery, if not more so, of the Soviet Union. Today, the suicide of the West, it seems to me, has taken the form of being blind to the obvious threats to the existence of America, being blind to the notion that Islam would seek our destruction, and blind to the notion that there are people always and everywhere who are your enemies, who mean you harm. And today is the contest between the West and barbarism. We will either take that seriously, morally, or we will watch the end of our civilization. I don't think there's a single American I know in this room who would submit to that. So there's much to do and much serious work to do for our country. So thank you for listening. And Benjamin, you're going to come up and tell us what to do.
We will now take a 15-minute break. You're welcome to refresh your beverages and use the facilities out the door to my left. If you'd like to submit questions for the Q&A session, please do that at the information table in the back room with no cards and pens. We will resume at 10:45 with our third session.